So good morning, afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our monthly best practices session. We're pretty excited today to welcome Charles Plant to speak on management and leadership. Charles has a long history of being an entrepreneur, and he's also worked at Mars. I don't know how many people here have heard him speak before. So you know that you're in for a real treat. So he was the founder of many things at Mars, including the Market Intelligence Team, that is a provincial resource, the Entrepreneur's Toolkit, and the Entrepreneur's Toolkit Workshop. So a lot of the middle management here at Mars has worked with Charles as a senior leader, and we've learned so much from him. He was a real influence in the organization. So we thought we'd bring him here today to share his knowledge with you, as he has knowledge of running not only large organizations but also entrepreneurial ones. He left Mars last year after being CEO or CFO, and he's now the founder and chairman of Material Minds. He founded this management training company because he had run into one too many managers who were overworked, overwhelmed, and armed with little management training. Those managers weren't at Mars, were they?
Oh, no.
In a career spanning 30 years, Charles has coached over 1,000 managers. He spent 4 years at Mars leading a group of former entrepreneurs and specialists who provided education, mentorship, market intelligence, and capital to over 2,000 technology startups. Prior to Mars, Charles spent 15 years as co-founder and CEO of Synamics, a telecommunications software firm that provided mass calling platforms to telcos. And additionally, he has taught management accounting at York Schulich School of Business, where my class, I think, nominated you for a teaching award. Yeah, so he's a fantastic accountant.
Jeez. I'm once again relegated to the roles of an accountant. I absolutely hate that. First I should apologize. I spent most of my career concentrating on management, not on leadership. And it's only been in the last year that I've started to discover what it takes to be a leader, which is really an odd thing. When after 30 years of 3 degrees in business, countless work placements and things like that, I'm just now figuring out what it takes to be a leader, which is interesting, and you'll see maybe why at the end. Is anybody here taking a course in leadership? Where was the course? Was it classroom based, or what sort of course was it? Classroom? Oh, you've been at one of those large organizations that
Outward bound.
Oh, outward bound. Oh,
But that's not the limit of it, but
yeah. So it's difficult. Outward bound's a great example of where you can teach leadership because it's situationally based. A lot of the leadership training comes out of classes nowadays, which isn't all that effective. And I look back at all of the things I've taken. I've got 3 degrees in business, which is entirely too much. I've worked in umpteen places, including some rather large organizations, banks and auditing firms and things like that. But nowhere did I really take any courses on being a manager, on being a leader. And it's one of those things, people here are engineers, they're accountants, some of us, you've spent a lot of time getting trained in a specialty, haven't you? But how much training have you had in being a manager? How much training have you actually had in working? And so this whole aspect of being a manager and leading is something that's really a mystery. It's accidental. People seem to learn this by osmosis more than anything else. So I've gone around in the last year trying to figure out, how do people actually learn to manage and how do they learn to lead? And they do it in 3 ways. They learn it by watching other successful leaders. They learn it by trying things out, and they learn it by discussing things with their peers. They don't learn it in a classroom. That's what you were probably doing in Outward Bound. You were put into situations which required you to try things out. You discussed the leadership concepts. Great organization, so I'm glad that somebody hears from it. So let's start out with that apology that, I'm still trying to figure this stuff out. Someday I'll get it, and by that time I'll be dead. Management versus leadership. And, I used to quote this stuff all the time, and there are people who worked with me who know perfectly well, and someone can probably say it, what are the 5 parts of being a manager?
Carrie, help me. Plan, organize, staff.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very good. And we'll go through that in a second. So management, sorry? Stereo.
two speakers.
Oh, okay. Leadership, I've said, is about setting the vision, communicating the vision, and motivating people around the vision. So they're essentially different. You can be a good manager and a terrible leader, or a good leader and a terrible manager. They aren't the same things. In fact, you don't even need to be a manager to be a leader. You don't even have to have that role to be a leader. So what I'm trying to get here today is, first of all, there are big differences between these two things. And as we go through, we're going to start talking about some of the management things, and it eventually evolves into what is the leadership component of that. So we'll see how that works out. What's really interesting now is, who here is in the technology field? A lot of people? It's odd that some people aren't claiming that they are. We've had, who here doesn't have a computer on their desk? Exactly. Or a cell phone or something like that. We've had 30 years of miraculous productivity gains, although it's hard to define them sometimes because a lot of the productivity has gone towards creating the products that are used to become productive. So as a total sum game, there isn't any more net productivity gain. Be that as it may, we've automated factories. We've done a lot in the world of data management, and we've done a lot in communications, and your lives are affected by that every single day. So the next great lever towards productivity is management. And when you look around and you say, okay, where are we going to get the gains in the future? We're going to get the gains from being better managers rather than going through all the technological types of things. So I have a few videos to play here, and I thought,
someone who knows how to engage their team individually and as a group. So they know their people, they know their team, they know their strengths, they know how to bundle those strengths, how to decouple them when they have to, but they understand that the people in the team are not tools, they're critical to their success, and they know how to reach them. They understand how to reach them. They understand what's important to those folks. They know what's important in their lives. They know what they want from a development perspective. The bottom line is that they're engaged. And when people are engaged, you get business results, and you get people working at their highest level of capability, which is what every manager should want, every organization. I would hazard to say, and I don't know this, probably people are working at 50% of their capability, probably, maybe even less across all organizations. We are not harnessing the capability of people.
so how many of you have had a job where you felt disengaged? Would you call yourself, when you were disengaged, were you productive? Could you have been more productive? And what was the problem? Motivation. You know, it's fascinating when you ask that question. I won't ask the question how many people are disengaged now, in case their co-workers are in the room, and that would be quite damaging to potential work environment. But it's phenomenal when you go out and ask how many people actually are disengaged and aren't motivated, and what results could accrue to the organization if people were motivated. And that's why I call management the next great lever, is because being able to put in place the things that are necessary to get the most out of employees, and not by working them harder and harder, but getting the most of their brains and their passion out, is something that will produce the incredible results. You've all heard of great companies. There are some great companies, like IDEO is a great company to work with. Apparently Google is in many regards, and companies like this. They are great because they are using this lever. So this lever exists. But you know, the question is, how are we doing at developing leaders? There's a good study out of Development Dimensions International, which has a global leadership forecast. And I only saw this recently, and it is really, really interesting to see how important leadership is. Because you think, oh yeah, I know that could make some difference in an organization. It makes an absolutely phenomenal difference in an organization. This chart, and it's a little hard to see, along the left-hand side or axis, if you're mathematically inclined, is what leaders think of the percent of leaders rating their organization's overall performance better than their competitors. So are you better than your competitors or not? And then the quality of leadership. So the interesting thing here is there is an absolutely direct correlation between the quality of leadership and the success of a company. It's not one of these fuzzy things. I mean, you can't get much clearer graph than this. And I've seen all sorts of other pieces of research that go on to show exactly the same thing, is that it's leadership quality that produces results. Now, many of you admitted to having been disengaged. Who here has worked for an idiot? Okay, Alan, you worked for me, and so that's really unfair for you to be answering. You know, I'll take that as a personal insult. When you were working for an idiot, were you a high-performing group? No, you were a low-performing group. How many here have worked for a really great leader or a really great manager? And were you high-performing then? Yeah. See the difference? And you know, it's astounding, but that companies don't invest more into developing the talent in their leadership because it has such direct impact on results. So if you look at critical skills that people have identified as thinking that this skill is critical for leaders, things like driving and managing change, identifying future talent, fostering creativity and innovation, coaching and developing others. Who here has worked with a good coach before? Did it make a difference? Now, was that coach your manager? No. Now, wouldn't it be ideal if your coach were to be your manager? Because that person can directly connect what you're doing on an everyday basis to what your results are. So that whole aspect of these critical skills, they're critical for organizations to step up to get involved in order to progress. But how are we doing? Astoundingly poor in the results of this survey. 50% of leaders are ineffective in critical skills. 38% of companies, only 38% have what people would identify as high quality leadership. 18% of companies have strong bench strength, meaning they can figure out who the next follower is for the person who's in charge. 31% have effective leadership selection. Isn't that horrible? It's absolutely astounding when you think of the amount of time that people are investing in computerization, that they're investing in automating the factory, investing in data management, investing in communications, how little they're investing at the same time in developing their future leaders, developing critical skills in people. And it's sort of something that people don't even talk about. It's given, you know, people will say, oh yeah, we've got training programs, blah, blah, blah. They're not coordinated, they're not organized. They aren't addressing the right set of skills and the right set of problems. Either we're not doing enough training or the training that we are doing isn't working. So amongst the group here, you know, some people have had management and leadership training, correct? How much did you have? I got zeros. A lot?
Well, when it's by example and your manager is your teacher, it's a lot.
A lot, true. How much structured management and leadership training? Did you do Outward Bound because it was a voluntary thing for you or because of work? Yeah.
5 days a year.
5 days a year? Was that good? Was it enough?
No, it wasn't enough.
But
Courses or specific events, yeah.
has anybody had more than 5 days a year here? How many people have had zero structured training on management and leadership? That's astounding, isn't it? How are your organizations developing people? So as I've been going out talking to people, I've been talking to them about how they do this. And when I started out with the idea of a company in mind, I started out with the concept that we weren't doing enough to reinforce skills. And so my first proposition was I was developing tools to allow behaviors to be reinforced. As I went on, I discovered that the problem is that the way people actually learn to be managers, and this is interesting because we got Outward Bound and another good case of watching a good manager here, where people learn to be managers by watching a good manager, by trying things out, by discussing. So I moved to that ability. And then I went and I was at a lecture recently by Alain de Botton. Does anybody know who I'm talking about? He's a famous intellectual British guy who discusses atheism. But what he was saying is that in terms of training for behaviors, the best example of what you have to do is the church, any organized religion. Because an organized religion reinforces training on a weekly basis. and they have a calendar of events throughout a year that reinforce different things at different points in time in the year. So on the one hand, we have behaviors that are taught by religious organizations that are fairly comprehensive and fairly in-depth and continual throughout one's life. Now, how many people actually live up to the aims of most religions? It's hard though, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yeah.
It's very difficult.
Especially in management.
Yeah. So you try the same training in management and leadership, and how many people can live up to those skills? Very complex to get those types of skills embedded in people. So, you know, in looking at this, I sort of said, okay, I could come up with 7 key skills to turn you from a manager into a leader. And I don't know if 7 is the right number. You know, come back in a year and I might have found 9, or I might have discarded 1 or 2. So this is not an absolute, I just picked 7. Now, at the very end, we'll discuss why I picked those 7. But I guess I partly picked them because each one of them for me was an aha moment that significantly influenced what I was doing and how I was doing it. And so that aha moment has translated through the rest of my life, and because of that, I call it a key or a critical skill. You know, I learned it in different places. Some of it I learned actually by not working, which was interesting enough, and being able to reflect back on what I had done and hadn't done. And we'll get to that at the very end. So the first skill is getting results. Now, who here follows the Toronto Maple Leafs? Now, who here is happy about following the Toronto Maple Leafs? Are you happy about living in a city where the team has failed to make the playoffs for 7 straight years? How about the Blue Jays? Years of middle performance? Are you happy about that?
No.
No. Why aren't you happy?
I'm the winner.
You want to be with the winner, don't you?
Yeah.
You really want to be on a winning team. So the first key thing for a manager or a leader is the manager or leader has to be able to deliver results. All of this came to me, and the act of getting results was a conversation with my father that I had probably 30 years ago. And I can't remember what we were talking about, but he said, you know, if you want to do well in business, you've got to get results. And the way you get results is doing the job of a manager. And here's the job of a manager. And when he said, here's the job of a manager, what he did was he gave me a book. And the book was Drucker on management. Now, Drucker wrote the book. Has anybody read Drucker on management? Okay. He wrote the book in the 40s, I think. And I give it out to people, and people look at it and they go, what? Why are you giving me a book from the 40s? This is ridiculous. It is absolutely the best book on management ever written. It really defined the whole practice of management for the rest of the world. It gave it some foundation and something to do that. So Drucker's book on management has been very key for me in getting results. And I sort of go through this litany, and I went through it earlier with people who remember it, is that there are 5 things: plan, organize, staff, direct, and control, that come from Drucker. So the first of this is, to get results, you need a plan. And you also need to have that plan written down. Who here actually has a plan as part of their work that's written down? Now, do you do the plan and then look at the plan the next year, or are you looking at the plan every month? Who here actually looks at the plan on a monthly basis? So for those of you that actually look at the plan and go back to it on a monthly basis, you actually have an effective plan. You have something that is possible to do. The plan doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to be 50 pages. It just has to be, you know, it could be 1 page, it can be 4 pages. It should lay out what you're trying to do, who you're trying to do it for, why you're trying to do it, some basic, simple things. But without a written plan, you really can't get anywhere. The second thing is you've got to make sure the team's work is organized. And that's a difficult concept to figure, well, what is organization, what isn't organization? The best way, and I was thinking about how do I explain this, is that your plan has to lay out clearly who's supposed to do what in a way that makes logical sense and doesn't conflict one with the other. And the biggest part of that is the non-conflict, because conflict between objectives in people drives organizations mad. Has anybody here worked in an organization where there's conflict between what they're doing and what somebody else is doing? And what's that like?
Constant negotiation, not a lot landing.
Constant negotiation. If you both have overlapping objectives, and you've got an ineffective organization, and as a result of that, you get people talking all the time about who's supposed to be doing what and who isn't. If you leave gaps in an organization of accomplishments in the plan, you have all sorts of things that fall through holes. But more often than not in an organization, things don't fall through holes, they actually are in conflict, one with the other, people working against each other, trying to get something done. Next thing is you have to have the right people on board. Now, plan, organize, staff. So having the right people on board is hard. When you have the job you're in now, how much time did you spend being interviewed by the organization before you started? Anybody?
2 months.
3 months.
You had 2 months? Oh, you had a bad person hiring you, obviously. Yeah. That was me, sorry. But in most cases, how long do you spend? How many times do you meet with the company? A couple of times? And for how long? A couple of hours? How much time do you get to know the company, and how much time do they get to know you? Sorry?
Not much.
Not much. It's very, and I've used this before. People have bought houses here. How much time do you spend looking for a house? A lot. But in comparison, how much time do you spend looking for shoes? A lot. It's one of those things, it's sort of like buying a house. People spend less time looking for a house than they do looking for shoes. People spend not enough time looking for the right staff. The key in the right staff is we'll get into in a second, but we'll hold it there for now. Next thing is direction. Plan, organize, staff, direct. People have to have the right amount and the right type of direction. They have to know where they're going. This is where the plan comes in, and having the right people on board. So they have to be guided in the correct direction. They have to know not to do something and to do something. So providing those clear and unmuddied directions is essential to success. And the final thing is control. And control is an interesting concept because people think of control as controlling the individual, but it's not really. It's just a feedback mechanism. It's a way of saying, yes, they're on track for doing the right thing, no, they're not on track for doing the right thing, etc. I used to torment people by making them produce monthly reports. Does anybody here produce a monthly report on their activities? What does it do for you?
Makes sure you're on track.
Yeah. It's the feedback mechanism for yourself. Not only for everybody else, but it's the feedback mechanism for yourself that relates what you're doing back to the plan and allows someone else to look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense. So the control aspect here isn't one of you must do this. It's the feedback loop that's linking back to the plan that's putting everything together. Essential for the organization. And as part of that, skill 2 is metrics. And you'd think I would have learned metrics sooner than I did because I was an auditor and I was a banker and an entrepreneur. And it really wasn't until about 10 years into running a company that I really discovered how useful metrics are. As an accountant, which Carrie had to point out, I had to learn something about metrics, but I really didn't pay much attention to them. And I started to because Synamics was a fairly complex business to run in that we had very complex products sold to very complex organizations, telephone companies, and we did very few sales a year. Our sales were in the $500,000 to $2 million range, so you don't have many of those until you're an absolutely huge company. And the problem we had was we never knew what was coming down the pipe. We never knew. We'd sort of look out and say, what are sales going to be like? Well, in order to do that, you have to have a really close grasp on your metrics. So what I did was I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was important and what was driving the organization. What were the key ingredients? What did I measure? What do I need to measure to make sure I'm getting the results? And I developed a model that I tweaked several times a week that looked at all of the things that people were doing and translated those back into what the results were going to be. And it was miraculous. We went from break even, once I'd started that, to being profitable, quite profitable, and were continuously profitable for 5 straight years, just because I spent so much time figuring out metrics. So in terms of usefulness, it's phenomenal. But the things you need to measure, as people say, okay, what do I measure? There are 3 things really that are the bedrock of an organization. 3 things that define an organization beyond its competitors, and they're quality, cost, and speed. So take a look at restaurants, for instance. McDonald's. What would you say about McDonald's in terms of quality, cost, and speed?
Fast, cheap, bad quality.
Do it as lean, bad?
But they're consistent quality. You can get the same Big Mac in Toronto that you can get in Paris, if you happen to like that Big Mac. Is there anybody here from McDonald's?
The service is never consistent.
Service, well, okay, then they've got a problem in quality, don't they? They need to fix that. But you can define them and look at High's Steakhouse or something like that. What would you say about quality? High quality, high cost. What about speed? Low speed, very low speed. In fact, if you happen to be in Brampton, getting to High's Steakhouse is like, you might actually have to make a reservation. It might take you 2 weeks to get a meal at High's Steakhouse, whereas in McDonald's you can have one in 10 minutes because there's likely one within a 10-minute drive. So you've got these various dimensions. Those are the 3 dimensions, and we sort of lapse into business strategy here. Those are the 3 dimensions by which you can define any organization: quality, cost, and speed. So when you're looking for things to measure quality, cost, and speed. And that encompasses all the things that you could ever want to measure. Key is, don't measure too much. There are some organizations that have tons and tons of measurements. That doesn't work either. There's sort of a balance that you have to try and get to with time. So there are 2 types of measures when you're looking at metrics. The first is activity measures. And activities are the things that you do. So for instance, Mars here is holding a course. That's a 1. Holding the course is a 1, and that's an activity measure. Mars has 20 or 30 Entrepreneurship 101 lectures. That's an activity measure. It might have 12 best practices. That's an activity measure. So the things that you do are activity measures. The next is outcomes. And outcomes are the results of what you do. They're customer reactions. So for instance, today there are about 50 people attending best practices. So that's an outcome measure. So you have both an income measure and an outcome measure. And you can start to look at quality because let's say we're measuring this activity here. You look at a particular trend line in the number of people that are attending lectures. Is it going up? Is it going down? Are we able to charge? Aren't we able to charge for some types of things? Are good measures of quality. In terms of cost, there's probably a proxy is how much time an individual has to spend in order to put on the event. Is an activity measure. The outcome is how much people are willing to pay. In terms of speed, there might not be a speed measure on this one, but you can see with most things there are all sorts of ways of looking at quality, cost, and speed from activities and outcomes. But the real key isn't that. The real key is to link these up. To have good metrics in an organization, you have to link your activities with your outcomes. And what you do is you look for a causal relationship between what you do and the customer result. So what we did at Synamics was we actually looked at the whole sales pipeline, and that's what we spent most of our time measuring. And the sales pipeline for any organization is, okay, customer is aware, you've had a meeting with them, you've given them a proposal, they've accepted the proposal, you're negotiating terms. All of those are activities, some of which have aligned outcomes to it. And what you measure is how many people do you have to actually have meetings with in order to get a sale. And once you figured that out, you would say, okay, I need 10 meetings in order to get 1 sale. Well, on a monthly basis, then you want to be measuring how many meetings you had and how many proposals you did, because you know the speed constant is how long does it take to get from meeting to sale. So you can then figure out, okay, I had 10 meetings, that means it takes 6 months to go from meeting to sale. In 6 months, I should have 1 sale. Simple math. but that's the key of metrics. And every organization has to have those metrics. But more than that, every individual also has to have metrics. So you take the metrics for the organization and you give every individual in the organization a similar set of metrics to enable them to judge how they're doing on a daily basis. How many people here have gone to performance appraisals not knowing how they're going to be judged? Does that drive you nuts? That's part of the problem. Without the metrics and without you measuring results in a certain way, customer satisfaction is a quality measure, employee satisfaction is another quality measure. So without measuring those things, you go into a situation where you're judged and have really no way of knowing how you're doing. So the next one is materiality. This is a bit of a complex issue. Let me just play this first.
A lot of people I find can become so absorbed with getting something just so, in terms of, some people call it paralysis by analysis, but the thing has to be so perfect, and they don't have a knowledge of what we call in economic terms opportunity cost. And most people are familiar with the term opportunity cost, that concept that, yeah, I can spend my time on that, but gee, what else can I spend my time on? What am I giving up by spending an extra 3/4 of an hour getting that email just perfect? If you have goals, then your awareness of your opportunity cost is significantly enhanced, because you can look and say, well, these are all the things that are important to me, and these are all the things that I'd like to accomplish, and gee, yeah, this one I could spend more time on that, but I'm ignoring that one. I'm not going to get a start on that one. This one's going to slip between the cracks. So having that awareness of your goals will allow you to say, yep, this is good enough. Let's move on, because I got bigger fish to fry right now.
How do you know when to stop when you're doing something? How do you know when enough's enough? And I learned this in one particular event many years ago. It was at the beginning years of Synamics, and we were producing a proposal for American Express, I think it was. And two of us, VP Sales and myself, worked for 4 days on the proposal to American Express. Nights, everything, just solidly. And finally at the end of this, I said, this is absolutely stupid. We will never do this again. We had written from scratch the whole thing. Although we'd written proposals before, we took each of them and said, we have to start it all over again and do it from scratch. I said, from now on, we're going to do a proposal in an hour. There must be some way of figuring out what matters so that we could get it tweaked so it's possible to do in an hour. And this is where the concept of materiality at work really laid down for itself, because it worked. We were able to do that. Materiality as a concept is something that I learned on my first day on the job as an accountant, because accountants, you might think, work towards accuracy. They don't. They work towards good enough. And that's why there's so much problems in the accounting world. But beyond that, this was fundamental to me to realize that if I could do something, I could do it faster. And the rest of my life, I've spent trying to figure out how not to do things slowly. When I look at something, I figure out, what don't I do? How can I avoid doing this? How can I do this so I never have to do it again? And how can I do it in the shortest time possible? And I use the term of materiality, or this concept, to guide me. So if you look back at metrics, because that's why we introduced metrics here a second ago, if something doesn't have a material effect on your metrics, you shouldn't be spending any time on it. So if you say, okay, I'm supposed to lay out this quality at this cost and in this turnaround time, and you have a project to do, if it doesn't materially affect the quality, the cost, or the speed, then don't do it. Don't spend time on it. Get it done as quickly as possible. One of the best examples I've seen is board reports. And some people produce the most voluminous reports for boards of directors. Now, has anybody here been on a board of directors? How much do you read the reports? In fact, if you look at the binders that go out in board reports, my bet is the directors don't spend half an hour reading what has taken weeks to produce. They can't. Nobody has the time to do this stuff. When you're looking at reports, even internally, when somebody's written a report inside your company, how much time do you spend looking at it and reading it? Do you just look at the end and see what the recommendation is, and if it makes sense, you go okay? Or do you read the whole thing?
I'm in a different world, so.
Or you're, oh, different world, okay.
Very.
Reading the executive summary.
Read the executive summary. So this whole report is really just done for, you know,
Well,
it helps them arrive at the executive summary in all probability. But when it comes down to it, there are ways of doing it in a much, much faster time period. At Mars, and I'll tell this story on Alan, because I hate doing board reports. I really hate it. But as CFO of Mars, I had to do this voluminous report to the board. And my first thought was, oh, how do I get out of doing this? Well, it's easy. I'll make it a training exercise for Alan. And so he was really eager to work on the board report. That'd be unbelievable. But because it's good training for him. Similarly, he's hopefully didn't spend too much time on it. But that's the sort of thing you've got to do. If it's not going to affect the quality, cost, or time, because I know the board doesn't read these things, it's not worth spending any time on. The next thing is,
and now I only spend 1 hour on it every quarter.
you do? Isn't that phenomenal? The next thing is materiality, is the 80-20 rule. The 80-20 rule is another guide that you've got to remember, is that 20% of your time produces 80% of the results. The other 80% of your time produces 20% of the results. It could even be a 90-10 rule. So if you're setting out, and I use the writing the memo because people really spend a lot of time, inordinate amounts of time writing memos and reports and emails when it doesn't matter. They get to a certain point in time in doing it, you've gotten 80% of the way there. Spending that extra little time to go from point A to point B is a phenomenal amount of time, but doesn't get you much farther in quality. You've got to realize that for everything you do, there's a curve like this. And when you're working, work to the best point in the curve. Now, the amazing thing is, if you actually do this, the amount of time you'll save is phenomenal. Next one is the concept good enough, move on. And good enough, move on means, okay, I've done enough on this thing, it's time to get off and do something else. I had a different picture in there originally, but I was criticized for the picture. I'm sorry you won't be able to enjoy it. Does anybody say good enough, move on in their regular work? How often do you say it?
About every hour.
About every hour? Yeah. In fact, if you spend your time, and if your objective is good enough, move on, and you focus and concentrate on that, it's amazing how much time your work occupies. It's possible to reduce your work down to absurdly small amount of time by realizing what really matters, what metrics are key, how to measure those, and how not to do any extra work. This is where we talk about people who are, disengaged in their organization. They're spending too much time on things anyway. If they were more engaged, they'd spend less time on those things and actually get a lot more done. And that's where the power and the leverage of management and management training comes in. Next one, skill 4, is hiring. Let me just...
A lot of what I learned as the team started to get bigger was the importance of the interaction within the team. Early on, your idea is, okay, I just need a whole bunch of superstars, and these guys are all going to be fantastically smart, super driven, motivated, and let's go. And what you realize, in fact, that if you build teams that have a better mix, so that as the bumps in the road come, different people can stand up and take the baton and do things, it works better. And many managers, one of their biggest mistakes might be that they just hire people that are just like them. Because when they look across the table, they see them, they say, haha, this is it, he's going to fit into the team well, because he's just like me, and all the other people I hired, because they're just like me too. And it doesn't work, it's like the Irish potato famine. If you have just one thing, if something comes that one thing doesn't deal with well, your whole team doesn't work. If you have a good mix, then people will rise up when the occasion works, and it's more fun to be around different people and get different ideas.
Hiring was something I was really bad at. And I remember a few of the first hires at Synamics. One lady in sales that we hired came in, and on her second day at work, fessed up to the fact that she'd been in a group session on the weekend and they had to make a substantial change to their lives and commit to doing something different. And what she'd committed to the group to do was to buy a house. And she needed a $10,000 loan from Synamics on her second day of work because she needed to buy this house. And I said, oh my God, we obviously picked a doozy here. She lasted a week and a half. That was it. And another one that sticks in my mind, I actually named a club after. And this was an individual who, someday I'll meet again after telling the story. His name is Willie Lyons. And we interviewed him, we hired him, we had everything prepared, and he didn't show up the first day. And we're going, well, where's Willie? And eventually at 10:30 or 11 o'clock, we started phoning, thinking, where's Willie? I mean, there's got to be something wrong with this guy. Well, as it turned out, he never quit his last job. He just hadn't told us that he wouldn't be joining us. So the first woman, whose name I can't remember, and Willie Lyons, joined what I call the Willie Lyons Club, which is the mistakes I've made in hiring. You can't get hiring right. I figure if I get it right 80% of the time, that's great, but I better move quickly on the last 20%. It's something that is so complex, but so essential to putting the right team together. So the key to doing this, one of the first things is back to, and these things all interrelate, is job design. In terms of organization, you have to have all the work organized amongst people so that it makes logical sense and there isn't overlap. We've gone over this. But then you've got to give that one person a certain job that they're responsible for. But you also should say, okay, with that job there should be some metrics. It's possible to apply metrics to every single job out there and to define the responsibilities of every single person. You all have job descriptions, right? Probably? Companies seem to think, oh, I got a few no's there, but companies seem to think that job descriptions are important, but they don't spend much time. There are a whole bucket list of things that you've got to do. How many people have metrics in their job descriptions? Not a soul? Somewhat, sort of?
Well, there's two separate pieces usually. There's an individual performance plan that's supposed to reflect the job description, so the metric may not be in the job description, but it's in the performance plan.
Okay, so let me ask the question a different way. Does everyone have metrics in their performance plan? So there are some that have them. The key is to organizing the job in such a way that the person has responsibility and has the ability to produce on the metrics for which they're evaluated. Organizing themselves that way. Next thing, really key, hire for attitude and train for skills. And in that, it's interesting. I look for people with initiative and drive. I look for people who've done things before, because I know if they have initiative and drive, they'll be able to figure something out. I don't actually look for somebody who has all the bucket list of skills, because usually in what I'm doing, there isn't something that you can hold and say, well, there are 20 of those people. Maybe if you're hiring accountants, you can say there are 20 of those people. But if you're hiring for skills, you might get a total attitudinal mismatch. What's really important when James was talking about getting a team together is that the team have similar attitudes towards work. Similar sets of expectations and things like that. They might have different skills and different perspectives, but they're all positive and ready to go forward with their work. In hiring, I spent a lot of time reading between the lines in resumes. And it's really, really useful. You can tell a lot about a person from the resume. And it's not what they say, it's what they don't say. What you have to look for are things like, are they talking about their boss's job or are they talking about their own job? Are they results-oriented or are they process-oriented? I interviewed someone a couple of years ago, actually. It was just one of those informational interviews. And he's from a long sales background at TELUS. And I said, so, why do you think you deserve this sort of job in sales? And he went on and on and on about how good he was at process. And at the very end of this, I said, well, do you get results? And he started going, because that had never occurred to him. You can tell that about an individual from their resume. If they list their results, they're results-oriented. Do you want a results-oriented person, or do you want someone who talks about process? Because a process-oriented person will talk in their resume about process. A person who has great initiative will talk about the things they start. A person without it will talk about the things they maintain. So look at the resume as a way of looking into the soul of the individual to say, what is valued to them? Because what is valued to them is reflected on their resume. The next thing is the interview. Listening to the stories they tell. People here have tried behavioral interviews. I can't do those. I can't give people fake, here's Bob's situation. What would you do if you were Bob? Type of thing. What I tend to do is ask people to tell me stories. Because by listening to their stories, you can tell a lot about an individual, what their objectives are, what they concentrate on, what they focus on. Just as we talked about the resume, same thing. Do they talk about results? Or when they tell you a story, do they start at the beginning and go to the end, or is it a mishmash, mangled story? In fact, think of your coworkers when you ask them something. When they tell you and try to explain something to you, what are they explaining? Are they starting at the beginning and moving to the end? Is it logical? Are they talking about results, or are they talking about process? Are they talking about strategically or tactically? You can ask questions like, what did you hate most about your job? To listen to, some people hate interacting with other people. You can get into a person and what they're like by asking questions and just getting stories told. The next skill is delegation.
I think the largest one is that people don't delegate. They don't let their team members make the decisions, feel empowered to do what they need to do, just do their jobs. They require that they make all the decisions, they as the manager. They require that they be consulted on everything. If I've got the right people in place, then I need to get out of the way and let them do what they're doing, what they need to do, what they know how to do.
Who here has worked for a micromanager?
That would be the unmotivating part of that.
Exactly. What's it like to work for a micromanager?
You spend time being ready for everything that they may ask you to do.
Yeah.
Or check on you.
Like, what is astounding though, do you think those micromanagers like themselves to work for a micromanager? So why do they do it to other people? When you get right down to it, there are all sorts of things that you don't like as a manager that you probably do to the people you're managing. And that's what's funnily enough, when you get to delegation, is something that people always want. Who here wants to have responsibility delegated to them in work? Everybody, right? So why wouldn't you, if you're a manager, delegate responsibility? But you see, I could ask 100% of the people would say they want responsibility delegated to them. But when they come down to delegating, yeah?
There is one thing that has occurred to me, and that is control over the team. So if you know you have a high-functioning team, then as a manager, your willingness to delegate should be very high. But if you were not responsible for choosing the team, first of all, or for reasons beyond your control, the team isn't functioning optimally, which I consider the manager's responsibility, circumstantial situations, many, then there is a correlation between your willingness to delegate and your and your capacity within the team.
But that could be perception, couldn't it?
Leaving aside.
And how do you get them to improve?
Obviously, that's a coaching opportunity, and it should be taken.
Yeah, by delegating.
Right.
Yeah, to her point, I think there are levels of delegation. So with different people, you can't just completely delegate with everybody. There's different levels based on whether they're being mentored or coached and where they are in their development and that kind of stuff. I know you delegate everything, but I think other managers
Well, actually, I used to claim that delegation was what I was best at. I'm more an abdicator. I tend to go ahead, sorry.
You can't delegate management. And you have to, I think, understand you can delegate the task, you can delegate for someone to produce the result, but you can't delegate the management. And that's where I think a lot of people get tied up, is they're unwilling to give up on the task because they think it's management. And that's the control link.
So I got accused once by Terry Patch. I wonder if he'll be watching this video. by not delegating. And I looked very carefully, and this is the time when I started looking at, and this is back at Dynamics, looking at whether I delegate or don't. And what I found in many cases where I didn't think the person could take it, I did tend to micromanage. But in other cases, I abdicated. And those of you who've been subject to my abdications know what it feels like, is I say, okay, go get this done, and just, go ahead, do it, without enough time being spent. I hate details. I don't want to spend any time on details. I want somebody else to look after the details, so I tend to abdicate instead of delegate. So the key is understanding as a manager or as a leader what your job is. Your job is to get things done through other people. It's not to do anything yourself. In fact, the best managers do absolutely nothing themselves. They get things done through other people, and they run interference through the rest of the organization. So if as a manager you're proud at the end of the day of what you did, you've got to say to yourself, well, you shouldn't be. You should be proud of what your people did. And you shouldn't be taking credit. Your people should be taking credit, and you take credit through them. So that's the first aspect of delegation. If you do one thing well in a business context, if you do a good job with delegation, all sorts of other sins can be forgiven. Because when it comes down to fundamentally what people's first needs are as employees, is they need to have responsibility. They need to know that someone trusts them. They need to be left alone to be creative. And so that's very key as a one key skill to have delegation. You can do without the metrics, you can do without all sorts of things, but delegation becomes key.
I think the difference between delegation and abdication is setting up like if you have somebody who's afraid of uncertainty or doesn't like ambiguity, it's really bad as a manager to just say, oh, go do that, and not give them any tools, any sort of idea of what they're supposed to achieve. So I think that's another point that, yeah, abdicating is when you're not giving them enough to do what they might need to do. Because nowadays everybody's doing everything.
Yep.
So it's a lot of it's in
Yep. So in terms of micromanagement, we'll get to abdication again in a second. Micromanagement, we come back to the concept of materiality and metrics again. What is material for you will not be material for your boss. You are responsible for a certain level of materiality in quality, cost, and speed. Your boss has another different level of materiality for quality, cost, and speed. Because as metrics move up through an organization, you have people in, let's call them the lower levels of the organization, who are responsible for details, for whom details are material. So if you are doing your employee's job, you're doing things that are immaterial to your job. They might be material to your employees. So you're working at the wrong level of materiality. And that's why delegation is important to understand. It's also why you'll notice a lot of things link back to each other. It's important that you understand your metrics and you understand how your employees' metrics roll up into your own metrics, so you understand what is material and how it is material. Next thing, as Carrie was getting onto, is abdication. Don't just set out the objectives and ignore people. I mean, does anybody here have a boss that they talk to on a rare basis or something like that? So you have very little interaction?
Yeah, she's a surgeon as well.
Okay. That's abdication. And one of the keys to stopping abdication is what I use all the time, and now that I didn't before, and that there's actually books about, which is management by walking around. Has anybody heard the term before? It shows an interest in your people to be walking around. You can hear what's going on, you're in touch with their issues, you're solving things quickly, just constant touch points. It's friendlier in the work environment anyway. So you haven't abdicated, you don't take responsibility for their problems, but you're there, you have an open door policy, you're talking to them about things, you're settling issues as things go on, instead of meeting with your people only on a once every 2 week basis or some formal basis. Being involved in their lives is still part of delegation.
So what's your perspective on telecommuting or teleworking?
I frankly don't believe that it works. I had this debate at a session of MESH last year that I was presenting in, with someone who believes that it's possible for companies to have people in all sorts of different locations. That's not how people work, unless they hate other people. Does anybody here hate people so much that they don't want to go to work? I mean, work's a social place. Some of you might actually enjoy spending time with the people you work with. Am I correct? So when you come up with ideas, do you come up with them all alone in a vacuum? It's through interactions that you're coming up with ideas. This whole concept of telecommuting is, I think, bad for organizations. I think it's bad for the individuals involved. It's bad for their careers. I think it's non-productive. How do you manage by walking around when your direct report's in San Diego? You can't be in touch with them often enough. So, it is now possible technically, and this is where you get management training, and management is the next great lever. It is possible technically, because of advances in automation, data communications, and communications, to work remotely. But is it good for the organization? No. Anyway, I'm slightly opinionated on that. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Skill 6, listening.
Just going in and asking questions and listening. People, it was amazing when you talk to people and ask their opinions, they love it. Listening is so important because you have to listen to your clients, you have to listen to your boss, you have to listen to your employees, and they'll all tell you things. You might not like it, but it's the source of all sorts of stuff.
I learned many years ago when I was a banker that if you just let people talk, they'll tell you absolutely amazing things about their business that you'll never learn if you're doing all the talking. So I sort of spent time, and it always built in this aspect of listening and trying not to talk too much. I didn't realize how important it was until I started going out interviewing people about key management skills. And you've seen these people in the videos. What is interesting is that every single person listed listening as a key management skill. Is anybody here taking a course on listening? We have three people who've taken a course on listening. Absolutely phenomenal skill to learn, but not enough people spend time on it. Do it a lot. And I use the expression, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that proportion. I've used that mostly in talking to salespeople. When you're out selling is asking questions and trying to worm your way into the right answer, presenting something that meets their needs by questioning, constantly listening. The key to listening is to ask a lot of questions. Now, we've come up to around 1 o'clock. You said this was till 1:30, right? So I've got about 10 more minutes and then questions? Okay, because I saw a couple people leaving and I suddenly got worried that everybody was going to leave and I haven't reached the end.
Some people leave at 1 because they have work.
Okay. So, very good, yeah. So,
You have to telecommute back to them.
yeah, exactly.
They're not allowed to tell.
They have to do something really valuable.
Yeah, exactly, as opposed to this. My son was heading out to his first dance. This was 10 years ago or so. And I'm a father. I have to give him advice for his first dance. And so what do you think the advice that I gave him was?
Don't try to kiss her.
Ask girls questions.
Yeah, compliment her on her shoes and ask her questions, lots of questions about herself. And that works in any type of situation, social situations, a work situation. You are thought to be the best conversationalists when? When you ask questions, not when you say anything. In fact, it's really easy. If you get in one of those awkward situations, I have a friend that I, when he starts asking questions, I know he's pulled them out of his repertoire. He actually probably remembers the set questions to ask because I hear they're structured in similar ways. But think of it yourself. You get into an awkward social situation, the best thing to do is just start asking the person about their lives. Most people love talking about themselves, don't they? A very key management technique, just ask people questions about their lives and they'll start relating to you better. Not because you've done anything special, but you seem to care. Then, okay, did I say seem to care? You see, this is where I said I'm just learning this stuff now, and sometimes I lapse into old habits of. If you are asking them questions, listen to the responses. And this is interesting in interviews when you're having an opportunity where you say to the person, do you have any questions? And they ask a question. And then they ask another completely unrelated question. What it means is they haven't listened to the response. The idea of listening to the response is you hear what they say and ask a follow-up question that relates to the response that shows that you've listened. So listening is a very interactive thing to do. It is not a passive exercise. It's interactive in coming up with the right question, figuring out the response and relating that to another question that gets another response and leads down a path. So a conversation is path-oriented instead of this wall of single question. I always got to laugh at interviews. Someone asks one and then a completely unrelated question. They've been told and they've scripted these questions out ahead of time. This is the question I'm supposed to ask at this point in time of the thing. The last one, well, I'm going to play this and then I'm going to talk about it for a second, of course.
It's not just about the numbers and the computer program and the process. In this case, it was a process control questions. There's people involved, right? And they have emotional stakes in all of this, and they feel about their work, and they self-identify with their self-worth is tied up in what they do at work. And you, being one of their colleagues, if you do things, it's going to modify that and change it, and it's going to affect them. And if you're aware of it, you can make those things positive, and you can avoid these negative things. And certainly, it's something that at that time was a real revelation for me, and it's also something that as the time went on, I talked to my managers about it, saying make sure you pay attention to the human side of what's going on in your team, what's going on outside of your team, and understand that aspect, because it's as important as the day-to-day stuff and the technical stuff.
So I said at the beginning of this talk that I'm still learning this stuff. And I actually didn't learn this until last fall. And I spent a lot of time in Mars, and I was told continually that I was critical. People say, oh, you're critical. I go, well, yeah, I see a problem. I say, this is shit, let's do something different. Sometimes I actually use that word. I was aware of the concept of emotional intelligence and knew that I didn't have any. But that seemed to be fine to me. And so I existed in this plane that came out as a result of my first two jobs, whereas I started life as an auditor and then moved to banking. But as an auditor and as a banker, you're in a power position. You have a power over the individual. You don't have to use emotional intelligence in auditing or banking. In fact, the more critical you are in those two particular roles, the better you do. And so being critical was key to my success early on. I became CEO of an organization, and frankly, people put up with a lot of stuff when they're working. And it's astounding. You don't really have to learn it, except perhaps with customers. And I did learn it with customers, but not with other people. So this whole concept of emotional intelligence was foreign to me in working at Mars. And if I thought something, I'd say it. I don't care. I don't care if people say something to me, so why should I care if I say it to them? And I was criticized for it, and I sat around and I looked, because I worked with Mars board for a while, and the Mars board is made up of more orders of Canada, I think, than any other board in existence. I don't know if you've looked at, you sit in a meeting and they all have these little pins. And I thought of designing a special pin for myself because I felt left out from all these orders of Canada. But every meeting I'd sort of sit and go, why are these people successful? What is it that made them successful? And I left it and I said, okay, Gord Nixon, he's a bright guy. He's very successful. He makes multiple millions of dollars a year, heads up the Royal Bank. Why is Gord Nixon sitting there and I am pawing at his feet for scraps? And I realized after talking with John Manley and Gord Nixon and all sorts of guys like this, is their ability was to make you feel better about yourself. You left every meeting with them feeling better about yourself. John Evans was the absolute master of that. If you ever have a chance to work with John Evans, you leave a meeting with John feeling pumped. They have a certain ability to understand what your needs are emotionally and to address those needs. And that was, to me, a very big revelation. In looking at what I had done in a work environment and how I had worked, I realized finally last fall, as I started to actually try and teach this concept of emotional intelligence, is I don't have any. What am I going to do? I have to learn this stuff if I'm going to teach it. I spent a lot of time reading a lot on emotional intelligence and looking back to what I had done and what I hadn't done and realized, oh my God, there's something key incredibly missing. Now, emotional intelligence is complex, and people have it in varying degrees in varying ways. For me, it was I would make every decision purely on a logical basis. I would not allow any emotional factors to creep into any decision. So I was denying the role of emotions in making a decision. Wasn't able to make a decision emotionally, had to make it logically. And once I got around this concept, life is much simpler. If you can acknowledge the fact that you can make emotional decisions and you make logical ones, and you have to recognize the influence of both of them in your decision making, you have to understand what your emotions are then. You have to acknowledge them. You have to work with them. You have to work within a context. So, emotional intelligence is something that's too complex to go into here, but the chart here of self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal decision-making, stress management are all parts and various facets of emotional intelligence. If you have a chance, there's a book, Golan, what's the author of the book's name? Goleman? Yeah. It is an old-fashioned book right now. It was written 10, 20 years ago, so the book's a harder read than it would be if it were written now. But get it, look at it, and look at yourself, because I guarantee that probably 25 to 50% of the things within that book that make up emotional intelligence, you probably don't do well and you could do a better job at. So it became key to me, this skill number 7 in developing. And what it really was, that emotional intelligence to me now means creating meaning in life, requires strong relationships, and to create those strong relationships in a work context requires emotional intelligence. You must have strong relationships, and to do that, you need emotional intelligence. You can't be just insulting people about their work by being critical because you know that logically there's a better way to do it. You have to take their feelings into account. And I tried to boil this down into one expression, because I was having a debate recently with a friend of mine who, he's a tax lawyer. So as if there's anything worse than an accountant, it's a tax lawyer for emotional intelligence. There is no emotion to the Income Tax Act. And so that's his life. So I was trying to figure out what's the key concept here. And I said, okay, the key concept, and it works very well if I apply it to all past situations, is you have to address the world in a positive manner. And what that means is you have to avoid negative expressions, sounds, attitudes, statements, and criticism. Now you say, well, how do you improve something if you can't criticize? Well, it's possible. It really is possible. Because instead of saying, you did this badly, you instead set up a context where you say, if you did this, the results would be here. So you compare the results from a situation to the input in a way that is a positive statement. And that's what John Evans and John Manley and Gord Nixon were able to do. They could express things in a positive manner, and innately you knew that they were saying you're not doing your job. But what it was, they were saying it in a way that held up to how you could do your job. So instead of being frustrated and expressing that frustration visibly, you hide that frustration visibly, keep a positive attitude, positive demeanor. In order to do that, you have to have incredible emotional intelligence. You have to understand how you're feeling it, why you're feeling it, what you're feeling, etc. That's number 7. Now, why these 7 skills? So I've laid out a grab bag of skills. There are other skills that are, somebody come up with another skill that I haven't listed here? Communication, yeah. Sort of buried in all sorts of different things here. Any other skills? I picked these for a particular reason. And it was in itself a revelation for me, is go back to what you need as an employee. To be an employee, you need to be successful. You don't want to root for the Toronto Maple Leafs. You want a team that's successful. In order to do that, you as a manager have to be able to deliver results. Next thing is you want to have clear measures. You don't want to be judged on things that are wishy-washy, hard to measure. You need clear metrics. You want as an employee to matter. To matter means you're doing things that are material. You don't want to think that your work is immaterial to the organization. You want to think that what you're doing really matters to the results of that organization. You want to be part of a team. I mean, there are some people that prefer to act solo, but most people, that's why people follow sports. That's why they're fans. I mean, the world is organized in teams. Even if we don't consciously do it, we subconsciously do it. Everyone wants to be part of a team, and they want to be part of a successful team, which is why hiring matters. People want to be responsible. And if you read the book, it's the book that introduced 10,000 Hours, Outliers. Outliers is a great book that talks about people's needs and responsibility and things like that in a workplace. People want to be responsible. They're responsible if you delegate to them. They want to be heard. People want to know that their opinions matter in an organization. They want to be heard, which is why listening is an important skill. And they want to be supported. They want to be supported emotionally with what they're doing. They want support from someone. They frequently aren't getting it at home. So work is a place. And if you go through it and you think, okay, why these 7 skills? These 7 skills are designed to meet the needs of employees. If you can meet the needs of your employees, you've gone from being a manager to being a leader. You're no longer managing tasks, you're managing people, and you're leading those people by meeting their needs. There's a whole world of thought out there in business that says, okay, ignore the customer, just meet your employees' needs and you'll do better as an organization. And there's a lot of wisdom to that. I tend to think you can't ignore the customer, but if you spend as much time worrying about your employees' needs as you do about your customers' needs, you'll develop a much more effective business. You will have developed that lever that is missing in many businesses, that lever of using people to the best of their abilities, getting the most out of people, having people engaged and coordinated in the business. So those 7 skills are really important, but it can all be summed up in one thing. And this one thing was really critical to me, and I didn't learn this until very recently. And I didn't understand why some leaders were good leaders. Why is Obama a good leader? Why was Martin Luther King a good leader? Why is your boss maybe a good leader or a bad leader? And it came down to one specific thing, and it sort of runs throughout all of these 7 skills, and particularly in meeting needs of your employees. If you want to be a leader, you have to make an emotional connection. You have to make an emotional connection with the people you're leading. And if you look at the leaders who you have followed that are successful, you will see invariably that those people make an emotional connection. Shall I say maybe a positive emotional connection, not a negative emotional connection. I should have qualified that. I have made lots of negative emotional connections in the past. The leaders that are successful are able to make an emotional connection and to meet their employees' needs in a way that others can't. And those are the individuals that are going to succeed in an organization. If you look and you wonder why people succeed and others don't, in fact, some people are great. And anybody here watch Survivor? So has anybody watched Survivor once? What invariably happens in Survivor is that the people who are most skilled are voted off before the people with the best social connections. Why? Because the people with the best social connections are able to make an emotional connection with other people. And in any corporation, the same thing is true. The people who have great technical skills rise to a certain point in the organization. To that point utilizes their technical skills to the maximum, but the ones who rise farther rise because they have emotional skills. They can make an emotional connection.
Could you comment on the success of leaders who lack emotional intelligence and are very successful, such as Steve Jobs?
Well, Steve Jobs. In fact, Steve Jobs is a great case. I'll take you, before Steve Jobs, there was a guy called Chainsaw Al Dunlop, who literally was Sunbeam, I think he ran for a while. And he was a horrible person to work with. Absolutely horrible. and he lasted a certain length of time. Those type of individuals, and Steve Jobs is a separate case, those type of individuals are needed at various times in an organization because they're change agents or they are chop and burn. The organization needs rapid change, no emotions. It needs to cut the emotion out and just get on with the business for a while. Those people inevitably leave the organization after a period of time. Now, oddly enough, my father was one of those people. And I watched him rotate through multiple senior level executive jobs, CEO and president of a whole variety of very large corporations. He was used because he was a hatchet man. In fact, one place they gave him a hatchet as a gift. He'll probably watch this. Hi Dad. Steve Jobs is a great case because he did make that emotional connection with people. He did inspire people. He inspired them to do their very best. And that was what's amazing. And people who couldn't do their very best could not last. He was ruthless on people who couldn't do their best. But he was great if you could do your best. So it's said that he lacked emotional intelligence. Well, he was at one end of a spectrum. He made an emotional connection. So he perhaps wasn't great at all of the things, but he did do that one thing that leaders do. He made an emotional connection with very high quality people.
Just wanted to go back to when you said you would be very direct with people, just tell them the way it is. A client several years ago, I would definitely tend to have that same issue. And some people would perceive whatever you told them as being very direct, and they liked that. And some people perceive it to be aggressive, and they didn't like it. And when I went to him and said, so what's the difference? He said the difference between direct and aggressive is when you've crossed the other person's threshold of tolerance. So it really is about them. Once again, that comes back to the emotional intelligence. But you, when you actually talked about your history, obviously were very successful, so you had to have some emotional intelligence. And when you didn't have it, you actually didn't care.
Right. I didn't care.
You only started to care when you actually changed roles, and it became something that you A, became aware of, but B, became a necessity to be successful in a new role.
But it's not a new role because I'm an entrepreneur again, and I'm actually working by myself, for myself, and will hire as few people as I can over the next few years. So, you know, I don't have anybody to manage anymore, so it wasn't essential. What it was more is a recognition that I'd struggled with making emotional decisions, and the realization that I could make an emotional decision and not have to have everything logical. When you're trained as an accountant, you're trained to make everything logical. So it was more personal than corporate that made me realize the importance. Thank you.